Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Ius Laboris client webinar, Coronavirus Getting Back to the New Normal. Our presenters today are all lawyers from the Ius Laboris firms in the United Kingdom, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal. And to introduce myself, my name is Annie, and I'm the BD coordinator at Ius Laboris, and I will be facilitating this session for you. We're now ready to start with the presentation. I will hand over to Colin Leckie from the United Kingdom. Go ahead, Colin, you are welcome to start.
Thank you very much, Annie, and hopefully you can hear me. I'm joined today by Linda Hines from Lewis Ilkin Dublin in Ireland, by Ines Reyes from PBBR in Portugal, and by Jose Miguel Mestre Vazquez at Sagadoi in Spain. And what we're going to do today is to present the seminar in really three parts. We're going to begin with some brief pen portraits of the current position in each of our respective countries. Then we're going to give you a thematic guide to some of the key short-term and long-term employment law issues that we're all seeing in our respective countries as we all try to work our way out of and navigate our way through the crisis. So without further ado, we've got a lot to pack into the next 45 minutes. We're going to start with those little updates on the position in our different jurisdictions. So if I can, I'm going to start with the position in the UK. For us here, the pandemic really hit slightly later than it did in some of our European neighbours, such as Spain and Italy. We didn't go into full lockdown in the UK until the 23rd March of 2020, but unfortunately the country went on to be the hardest hit in Europe in terms of total numbers of deaths, and one of the hardest hit in terms of deaths per head of population as well, around about 43,000 deaths as of a week ago. So it's taken a substantial toll on people here. From an employment perspective, each of us will speak to the different job retention schemes that have been put in place in our different nations. Here in the UK, we put in place in March something called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, the shorthand for which was furloughing, a word which none of us had really ever heard before, but which is now in common everyday currency. This was a scheme that was put in place, and any employer could use it, which has been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. It could choose with their agreement to place any or all employees onto the furlough scheme, and once you had done that, the UK government would pay up to 80% of your employees' wages, capped at a total of £2,500 per month. So we've had that scheme in place for over 3 months now, but as elsewhere, the government now looking ahead to the post-COVID world and starting to wind the scheme down. As of yesterday, employers have been able to put their employees onto something called flexi furlough instead. It had been a strict condition of the scheme that if somebody was furloughed, they weren't allowed to do any work at all for their employer. As of yesterday, that changed. If you want your employee to work some days but be furloughed for other days, that is now okay, and the government will fund you in part. The government is also going to start passing some of the costs of the scheme on to employers. So in August, they'll have to start paying employees' social security contributions and pension contributions, which they don't have to do for furloughed employees at the moment. In September, they'll have to start paying 10% of wages. In October, 20% of wages, and then the scheme is due to be wound up on the 31st of October. And I just saw just a few moments ago that the Prime Minister here has come out and said fairly clearly that there's no intention to extend the scheme beyond that date. Unlike in some other countries, the coronavirus job retention scheme didn't involve any requirement not to make employees redundant if you want to make use of the scheme. And the reality is that we're already seeing a lot of employers entering into individual and collective consultation exercises with their staff and their representatives in industries where unfortunately they've been so badly hit that they know that things aren't going to bounce back, and that's something that's already well underway. In terms of the return to work process and getting back to the new normal, the central document here is the government's COVID-19 recovery plan, which was first published on the 11th of May and has since been updated on a number of occasions. And that was put in place alongside guidance on how to reopen your workplace safely, which is aimed at various different types of working environments. So, for example, the one for offices and other shops, another for factories, and there are half a dozen or so more alongside that. And the UK economy has been gradually reopened since then at a slightly slower pace than in much of continental Europe, reflecting the delayed start here and the harder hit nature of the economy. But non-essential shops have been open since the 15th of June. And from this Saturday, 4th of July, bars, restaurants, and most excitingly of all, hairdressers, I'm really looking forward to getting my hair cut, will be allowed to open from this weekend. And only a small number of sectors will remain compulsorily closed on health and safety grounds after that. The guidance here, particularly relevant for those of us working from offices, remains work from home if you can do so. And I think that's likely to remain the case actually for some time yet, at least until September as far as we see it. And that's a particular issue for busier city centres, London of course, but other big cities as well, where employees are heavily dependent on making use of public transport in order to get to work. I think the statistic in London is something like 85% of employees need to use public transport in order to get to central London jobs, and that's obviously problematic and likely to remain so for some period yet. That's the pen portrait from the UK. I'm going to hand over to Jose Miguel to talk about the Spanish position.
Yes, hello, thank you, Colin. Well, in Spain, as you know, the virus hit very, very hard, extremely hard, and we were in lockdown during approximately 3 months. The pandemic started very soon. Lockdown began in March 14th, where was declared the alarm state. And it's still today, Spain is the 5th country in the whole world in terms of people affected, and it also in terms of the death toll. At the time of preparing this presentation, there were 29,000 deaths, something that was very polemic because we really don't know the final amount of deaths. By March 13th, where all the schools, college, childcare facilities, sporting and cultural gatherings were canceled due to the alarm state. And as you may know, during the first month for employment lawyers, we were absolutely swamped with work. It was incredible because I will say the vast majority of the employers request what we know here, aka the ERTE, which is the temporary wage subsidy scheme, which are 2 types. One based on force majeure, you cannot open by decision of the government, or rather you have to do some kind of measure, this kind of measure based on productive grounds. That led to cover 70% of employees' wages, and it's capped at 1,200 euros per month. And the government just approved last week a new extension with different economic aid to this kind of measures, extended until September 30th. More or less around 3 million people, 3 million employees have been requesting this subsidy, but because there were not enough resources in terms of technical human resources, there are many employees still that have not yet received such amounts, which is very, very incredible and very sad. As time went by, and very similar to the UK perspective, Spanish government published on April 28th a COVID-19 transitional recovery plan with 4 phases that gradually were intended to reopen the economy again. Although there is a preference for remote work, any employee whose services cannot be rendered remotely are exempted to work remotely. Until September 20th, companies should encourage remote work if possible, but look out, because the work inspector is going to watch closely if it is complied or not by the companies, with possible economic sanctions to be imposed in case of fraud, in case of not complying with that. Finally, a new benefit, what we call here the minimum living allowance, was approved with effect of June 15th. It only covers individuals, people with very difficult, very financial type situation, and it's an economic help, more or less. I calculate for 250,000 people are going to benefit from such allowance, and at the end, this benefit is 5,000 euros per year, and has opened a very deep debate in Spain to what extent the government should protect people under these circumstances, because there is no limitation in the period, because financially speaking, we have deep concerns about if it's sustainable or not. So this is more or less what I have to tell you about the perspective on Spain. What about you, Linda, in Ireland?
Thanks, Jose Miguel. In true working from home style, I've just had a large construction lorry pull up outside my house. So hopefully that won't impact everyone being able to hear me at the moment. So in Ireland, we're currently easing lockdown. The virus probably hit Ireland around the 29th of February, and over the 3 weeks following that, everything gradually closed. And from 12th of March, the real lockdown hit Ireland when all the schools, colleges and childcare facilities closed. I suppose it was so serious that even the St. Patrick's Day festivities all over Ireland were cancelled, which shows how seriously we were taking it in March. So people began working from home then, and the elderly and the vulnerable had to cocoon, it was called in Ireland. In terms of supports from the government, the temporary wage subsidy scheme came in, which is similar to that in other countries, except in Ireland, employees were still able to work fully throughout that, obviously where their workplaces were open. So that came in on the 24th of March, and it has been extended to the end of August, although it's being monitored by our tax authorities, and they have very clearly come out this week to say they will be asking employers to confirm that they are still eligible. And to be eligible, they have to have anticipated a loss of 25% of their trade in Q2. So any employers in Ireland should really look at that and make sure they're still eligible. From the 18th of May, the easing of our restrictions began. Initially, it was 5 phases. Those were moved down to 4 phases. And even within each phase, they're being sped up all the time, so they're being expedited. So we're currently in phase 3. So since Monday, since 29th of June, we can get haircuts. Colin, I hope you get yours soon. So most of our businesses can reopen. We do have limited numbers on gatherings indoor of 50 people and outdoors of 200 people. And then our final phase is really kind of when the holiday season, I suppose, will come back in, where our hotel bars, casinos, and large indoor and outdoor gatherings can happen. So everyone's working towards that, of course, with the fear of a possible surge happening again. Like in all the other jurisdictions, where possible, employees are still being encouraged to work from home. So I'm in my home at the moment. And there has been a detailed return to work protocol issued by our government and enforced by our Health and Safety Authority. They issued that on 9th of May, and it is quite detailed. It includes employee consultation, the requirement to appoint a lead worker representative in terms of COVID health and safety. You need to have a response plan and a specific policy in place. You have to do health and safety risk assessments. You have to keep contact logs. You have to have specific isolation areas within the workplace in the event of a COVID concern. Obviously, the hand washing, cleaning and physical distancing is in place. But you do also have to have carried out specific return to work induction training and questionnaires with employees before they return. So it is quite onerous in terms of the restrictions on employers in actually bringing people back to work. I'll hand over to Inez then to talk about the current situation in Portugal.
Thank you, Linda. Portugal has passed from best pupil and praised by all countries to almost last in class. We are currently the second worst, apparently, in all Europe, and probably not very much behind in terms of the world. The lockdown in Portugal was quite early, and the emergency state was declared on the 18th of March, but by then most private schools, not public schools, but private schools and private childcare facilities were already closed, and many parents were forced to work from home. So when the emergency state was declared on 18th of March, everyone or almost everyone was already at home. At that time, all non-essential activities were shut down, including non-essential retail, and those that would have the possibility of entailing large gatherings, concerts, any cultural events, cinemas, and also gyms. By then, the government reacted and decided to create some support for parents who were unable to work remotely and had to care for children who were still having school. School ended last Friday for everyone. So all the parents that were at home had to care for their children and attend homeschooling, especially with younger children. Being unable to work, the government felt that it was kind of unfair to let companies support the payment of the salaries and enacted some support. Companies also received financial support, a simplified layoff. Please note that layoff for continental Europe and for Portugal is what now is called in the UK and Ireland furlough. A layoff is a paid time off and not an unpaid leave as in the UK. So every time I speak about layoff is that. So the layoff scheme was a temporary support that the government enacted, and it is due to continue until the end of July. With that, the government bears 70% of salaries and the employers bear the remaining 30%. This can be with or without work being provided, contrary to what Colin said, that now you have a flexi furlough. In Portugal, that flexi furlough was always allowed. As of the end of July, things are supposed to unfortunately not get back to normal, but the government is understanding now that it is financially unbearable for the government to continue to support companies, and therefore the measures are possibly going to be low or much lower in terms of what will be the financial support. As from May 4th, lockdown has been gradually lifted at 15-day intervals to prevent the contagion cycle, or to be able to determine if there was a contagion during that interval. The country has been spared so far, but now with the ease on the restrictions, deaths have been increasing, +9 than the numbers here. And the cases are now 42,400 today. Lisbon metropolitan area has been especially affected, and public transportation is allegedly the means of contagion that is now taking place. So I will now pass on to Colin, who will start with some short-term issues that we have identified with this return or is on lockdown.
Thanks, Ines. So, well, as I mentioned at the outset, we're now going to proceed sort of thematically and look at some of the issues that we're all facing in advising employers on the way out of the crisis. As it's striking that many of the issues that come up are very similar from one country to the next, and there's a lot of commonality in the approaches that are being taken, and there are some sort of key employment issues really at the heart of that. So I'm going to start with some issues around discrimination law. Now, we're all covered, even us in the UK. We've already Brexited, and we haven't forgotten that that's coming up, hard Brexit, probably on the 31st of December of this year, but some other issues to follow from that. But for the time being, we're all covered by the same EU discrimination legislation, and of course, particular significance there are the various characteristics that are protected, a number of which are very relevant when employers are looking at issues that they have to deal with in the context of the crisis, and the protection that employees have due to sex, age, disability, and race in particular. The continued issue of home schooling is challenging. So as we've heard, in a couple of countries, we've already hit school summer holiday time. We haven't yet here in the UK. That's not coming for another 2 to 3 weeks yet, but all bar a minority of school children remain being homeschooled anyway. And of course, there are ongoing questions, frankly, everywhere about what will even be the position in September. Are schools likely to be open as normal then, or will we continue in this current rather difficult pattern? And that throws up in particular indirect sex discrimination issues, and it's widely recognised that women tend to bear the particular brunt of child caring responsibilities, and it's long been recognised in case law involving part-time workers that a female employee who's disadvantaged by a policy which favours those with full-time working patterns may be able to bring an indirect sex discrimination claim, and query to what extent, and there's some at this stage perhaps largely anecdotal, but I expect this to harden up over time, that there's a number of studies out there that suggest that those who have been hardest hit by the crisis, whether it's by being furloughed or by losing their jobs or by other adverse measures being taken against them, have been disproportionately female, to the extent that that's linked to association with childcare responsibilities in homeschooling. That gives an obvious potential basis for claims. BAME individuals, a lot of studies show that Black and minority ethnic individuals may be particularly vulnerable to the COVID crisis, and that's something I think is really quite challenging for employers, bearing in mind that the European discrimination legislation bars positive discrimination. So it is not open to employers to say, well, but because of your ethnicity, we will give you more favourable treatment when it comes to concerns about returning to the workplace than other groups may have, at least not without running the risk of claims. And really employers to some degree are on a rock and a hard place with this. So here in the UK, the government guidance, which requires all employers to carry out a COVID-19 specific risk assessment, says that employers need to take into account the vulnerability of BAME individuals when they're doing that, but at the same time they're precluded by law from taking any wider measures. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, which we've seen protests around the world in the past few weeks in relation to that, I think that lends this issue even further weight. And then, of course, you have the issue of individuals who themselves have a condition which makes them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, or who perhaps also may not have such a condition themselves, but nevertheless are living with or have caring responsibilities for someone who may be covered by the associative discrimination provisions. And we see the potential there for claims of disability discrimination, and also from older employees. As we know, the older age cohort you're in, the more vulnerable you potentially are to COVID-19. And this I think is a particular challenging issue for employers, and something we're all seeing at the moment is, well, how do we deal with this issue of the return to the workplace, and dealing with those individuals who either don't want to return to the workplace because they're concerned about the potential impact of COVID on them or someone they're close to, or who aren't able to, possibly because they're in a group which has been directly told by governments, it's important for you to shield and not return to the workplace for the time being. Employers may well want to say, well, if you don't agree to return to work, you need to resign, or we'll look at taking steps to terminate your employment. But that's precisely where you might get into questions about, well, would such action be discriminatory, and could that give somebody the basis for a claim? And the answer is that it may well do. So important questions to consider, such as, well, can the job be done remotely? Because many jobs have been done remotely perfectly effectively for a number of months. If it's possible to continue that potentially long into the future, that's something that you should probably look at doing. If you can't, then what are the other arrangements that you could put in place? For example, in a number of countries, the state may continue to provide you with a paid benefit that allows you effectively to sign yourself off as sick while you're shielding from the crisis. So that might be one way of keeping somebody in employment while ensuring that they have an income and aren't a significant cost to the company. Another option might be to agree with that person a period of unpaid leave. But what about the sort of issues you get into where someone's been out of the workplace for an extended time period and complains that maybe they've been overlooked for a promotion opportunity or a pay increase because of that reason? And really, the longer this crisis goes on for, and all the indications are that it's going to be with us for some time, we could be heading for a second wave in the course of next winter, the more pronounced these sorts of issues might become. I'm going to hand over now to Jose to look at some data protection issues, I think.
Thank you, Colin. Well, as a way of introduction, let me tell you that whether we like it or not, due to COVID-19, we have jumped definitively into the data protection era. And employers, I think they are really aware of that. All employers are really concerned about the exponential increase of phishing, ransomware, and other cyber attacks, which I think you are pretty aware that have been produced and even increasingly during these 3 or 4 months. Well, protection of data and security of information comes absolutely first in this scenario. Let me tell you that working remotely has been scarcely, well, I'm not talking only in Spain, but I will say by and large through all the EU, has been implemented scarcely. But after this long lockdown, many companies will assume it culturally and will adapt their activity in that sense. Well, to that purpose, tailor-made policy are really required with clear technical instructions and security. So all employees from the first to the last one must strictly comply with its use and connection, avoiding what we call the security breaches that, as I say, have been producing. In case of employees using their personal devices to work remotely under what is so-called the VIOT policy, the bring your own device policy, we strongly recommend that companies facilitate clear and precise instructions again about the protection of the device, which must count with antivirus, firewall, operating system, and software duly updated. Information must be protected with a VPN and avoid to any cost open Wi-Fi's, and use only companies' email and corporate programs provided by the company, and apply apply encryption on the storage devices to avoid any steal of those devices. It goes without saying that to reach these goals, training, guidelines, etc., is of the essence and need to be provided sufficiently to employees. If not, that will cause the end of this situation. With all these measures of security and protection I explained, employees are really still concerned about employees' productivity and efficiency. And for some reasons, they are creating new software programs which are thought to track the employees remotely, and are raising serious concerns about doubts and about an eventual breach on employees' privacy rights by these software programs. For instance, they try to control deficiency with the algorithm program that these software programs have, and that could jeopardize or could breach the privacy of the employees. A final word on new ways of negotiating with employee risks by platforms. During the lockdown, collective decisions have been taken about for instance, in Spain, the temporary subsidy scheme, which in some cases were negotiated, others not, but some of them were negotiated, and has obliged both parties to find alternative virtual ways to negotiate. These platforms are opening a new way to communicate and bargain with employees' rights, which was absolutely unthinkable 1 year ago. I will going to hand over to Linda. What's happening with the return of work, Linda?
Thanks, Jose. So I suppose as employment lawyers, a lot of what we've been doing in the last couple of weeks across all the jurisdictions is advising employers on how to be able to get their employees back into the workplace. So the really immediate, how do you manage the risk of COVID-19? And also, how do you continue to deal with people who are working from home? So certainly across all the jurisdictions we're talking about today, working from home where possible seems to remain the guidance. And certainly in Ireland and the UK, that's expected to last until September. So there's some real immediate health and safety risks for employers in that regard in terms of lockdown fatigue. So a lot of staff members who would have been able to deal with it on a temporary basis when they felt it was only going to be a few weeks or maybe a month or two are now facing into 6 months of home working and balancing childcare. So lockdown fatigue for the home workers is a real issue. As Colin referenced as well, there's a new divide between those employees who are really keen to get back into the workplace, maybe because they don't have a suitable home working environment, and those who never want to return. And then there's some employees who are somewhere in the middle, We're certainly finding that in our office. Some employees don't mind coming in a few days, but don't necessarily want to be in 5 days. And those are posing real challenges for HR and for facilities in terms of how do you manage it. So not only how do you decide who will come back, but how do you physically manage that? So a lot more rota planning and health and safety focused planning, which is something that employers didn't need to do as regularly before we had these urgent health and safety risk assessments being required. In all the jurisdictions, the health inspectorates are carrying out workplace inspections. At the moment, they will be focusing on retail and bars and places that are going to have customers in them. But ultimately, they may begin looking at offices to see what have employers done there and is there appropriate social distancing happening. We're finding in Ireland, the inspectors are coming into the premises and asking the employees, what have they been trained on and what have they been told? So that communication with employees and the consultation with employees on health and safety measures that need to be put in place is really critical at the moment. I think pressure has been put on a lot of employers because the reopening phases have changed so quickly in all the different jurisdictions. So where they may have been putting in a plan, they suddenly had to accelerate that. And obviously that can lead to mistakes around health and safety. So it's really important that they're going back to check that what they had planned initially still works. With our clients, we're seeing a lot of the offices have no intention to return employees until 2021, except for maybe a small group of employees who don't have suitable home working environments and need to be in the office. Some other clients are working on an A team and a B team basis. Always better to be in the A team, I think, by the sounds of it. But yeah, so they're basically rostering people in 1 week in, 1 week at home. And of course, there's lots of planning issues with that. The health and safety obligations are very onerous. So in some situations, we have clients deciding it's just easier to not even try and plan a return back to the office because it's just so complicated and so complex. But all the things I referred to earlier are the same across all the jurisdictions. So the social distancing, the training. And the big thing that was touched on a couple of times in our presentation today around work-life balance and managing employees who have childcare obligations. So really employers are having to get a lot more involved in employees' personal lives in terms of planning the health and safety risks about them returning to work and what their specific needs are. And your vulnerable employees, of course, need to be accommodated. And I've Collins touched on the discrimination risks, but there's also the health and safety obligations that we have towards those employees that must be considered because they're a higher risk. A huge area that we're seeing at the moment is concerns around employee well-being and anxiety. And again, that gets back to that lockdown fatigue point where people feel slightly less connected because they're not in the office. And then also the anxiety about actually returning to the office. So our people managers are having to become health and safety experts and psychologists in terms of all the return to work that they have to do, and very ably supported by HR who are working around the clock. The other thing is because the public guidance is probably changing regularly, employers are having to review and adapt their health and safety plans regularly as well. So a lot there in the short term. I'll just pass over to Inez to talk about the incentives to keeping your workforce.
Thank you, Linda. I think the main incentive on workforce retention, a bit all over, has been the financial support that we have heard from these 4 jurisdictions at the initial comments, but also a bit around the world. So generally, countries have enacted temporary job retention schemes, temporary wage subsidies. The names differ, but all the measures were aimed at helping companies to keep their workforces during lockdown, whether these workforces were able to keep on doing some work or not any work at all. It has been a common approach from governments, those paid layoffs, as I have identified initially, layoffs being understood as furloughing for the Anglo-Saxons. And Europe saw it especially, but also a bit around the world. We have been hearing echoes of this kind of financial supports being provided to both families and companies. The possibility of reduction in working hours, partially state-borne, has also been offered in some countries. And especially since lockdown restrictions have been lifted and businesses are intending to gradually reopen, this has been also a trend. So governments are now worn out financially, many of them. It is impossible to continue to pay companies to be closed. Let's not forget that in many countries, lots of companies and non-essential retail is a very important part of this, have been forced to close. And those employees are part of the universe that cannot be on remote work. So retail has now opened in most countries, but sales and generally trade levels are not as usual, and they are not expected, unfortunately, to be relaunched with the speed that we would all like. So, although many countries, Portugal and Spain are some of them, but there are many others that have imposed a time bar on companies, on businesses that have adhered and have used public funds to support their companies or their businesses during lockdown. These time bars have had as an aim to force companies to keep their workforces and prevent massive redundancies and people going to unemployment allowance at least on huge numbers. Others like the UK and Ireland did not, I believe Ireland did not, impose any time bar. Time bar on the employees, on the employers that have adhered to these funds. Nonetheless, and as we have seen, these businesses are not performing as they should, and many of these measures will not be able to be kept on Q3. Q3 started yesterday. So it is unfortunately very, very likely that with these supports coming to an end, or at least being readjusted in terms of their financial amount, that we will be seeing some restructuring and some companies having to make some downsizing very soon. I will now pass to Colin for the long-term issues that we have identified during our preparation of this webinar. Colin?
Thank you. And beginning with what we anticipate will be something of an uptick in litigation and associated complaints from employees, which we as employers and employment lawyers expect that we'll be dealing with for some time to come. Really, what's the message here for employers? Because really what you want to hear is, well, how do I avoid getting into litigation situations in the first place? And really this is the follow through from what we've talked about in the first part of the session. The best way to manage and minimize your risk is to ensure that you have good practices in place, that you're taking decisions about employees on a fair and consistent and non-discriminatory basis, that you put in place all of the right health and safety measures as far as the return to work processes are concerned, and that people comply with them in practice, that you don't rush too fast to make decisions on termination, recognizing, of course, the extreme economic reality that many companies are in, and that you have the right incentives to retain your workforce, make sure that you come out of this crisis on the other side in healthy shape. But again, a little bit anecdotal to date, not so many statistics so far, but I think all of us are collectively seeing that various labour courts and employment tribunals are seeing a big increase in claims already from measures that were taken during the lockdown, and they will continue to work their way through our systems in the years to come. And that they may be, for example, where pay cuts have been made, or bonuses have been withheld, and steps haven't been taken, perhaps because they can't be for financial reasons, by employers to reverse those, or they may be complaints of unfair dismissal, wrongful dismissal, or the relevant equivalent, and that might involve one of the sorts of discrimination angles that I touched on in the first part of the session from an employee who has been let go. For some countries, and both the UK and Ireland fall into this position where whistleblowing laws are quite strong, that there's a real live risk of employees seeking to pursue complaints where they have blown the whistle internally about a health and safety issue relating to COVID-19, and they're of the view that their employer either hasn't taken it seriously enough, or they've been dismissive of it, or perhaps there's been a dispute and the employee has ended up leaving the organization. Something that I think will become a theme again in all of our countries and others in the months and years to come are retrospective audits by the governments that have been paying out to fund layoff and furlough schemes during this crisis period, and whether that usage has been legitimate or not. There's some evidence that a number of fraudulent claims have been made, and steps may be taken to investigate those and take steps to address that. There are real life questions, frankly, I think just about everywhere, about the extent to which we really have administrative systems in our courts and tribunals that are up to the task of dealing with the huge volume of claims that are either there or on the way. In many cases, they were creaking even before the crisis began, and this is only likely to make things worse. And the time periods that we see from claims being filed to a judge hearing them in court are likely to get ever greater. But of course, we'll adapt and change, and we're already all starting to be involved everywhere in electronic hearings. In many countries, it was quite unusual to see a judge on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Google Hangouts or whatever, but that's increasingly becoming normal, and we can expect to see that only expanded as systems seek to cope with the huge increase that we're seeing in the number of court proceedings. On to Jose now.
Yes, thank you, Colin. Well, in this scenario with COVID-19, there is a turn of the screw about the working time register, which has been an overhaul in the whole Europe. There's a real problem for employers to control real working time of employees. And due to that lack of control, employees may report massive overtime. And it seems very difficult to control whether or not such information, such report is true or is not true. Employers are implementing measures to calculate time, connected and disconnected, to avoid paying overtime. The working time directive may not fit really with flexible and remote working. The purpose of the directive, if you remember, was the health and safety. This is an opinion. To my mind, the directive should be adapted to this new era of remote working, which is going to be implemented by and large in the whole Europe. But not only thinking in aspects of health and safety, but also purely in the working time register. Other aspects to highlight, well, employees here in this situation are at full disposal during endless working hours. So there is a clash with that right of digital disconnection that has been implemented, for instance, in France, also in Spain. There is a trend towards possible flexible and extended working day at the employee's convenience. According to some statistics I found, the Spanish, French, or British have at 2 more hours working daily, Americans 3 more hours. There is a trend to that digital hyperconnection that may or may not cause social problems at home with family and not enjoying leisure time. Some legal risks about remote working, obviously, that have to be put in a piece of paper with a written agreement, limiting, maybe if that's possible, time and place. Since if they work, for instance, in an overseas location, that could impact tax, social security, treatment, may have even immigration implications, etc. There has to be an adoption of traditional rights in a new regulation, training, promotion, health and safety, collective rights, and possible new rights. For instance, what happens with all the expenses the employees have invested or are using for working, for instance, internet connection, electricity, etc. So there is a big challenge, I think, with equal treatment for the employers, referring to employees, those that stay at the workplace and those that are working remotely, and they have to be treated in the same way to avoid, as Colin said, discrimination. The big question for me to employers is that how to combine sporadic and permanent remote workers. There is kind of a sense of lack of control. Are we in the end of the traditional workforce, everyone going to the office? I think, to my mind, that I think there's going to be a combination of remote and traditional working system at the workplace that's going to linger for the next years to come. And I think the good effect of that will be that it will incredibly help working and personal life balance for employees. I'm going to hand over to Linda.
Yeah, and following on from that, we talked about the short-term health and safety issues really being about getting your employees back to work straight away. But long-term, I think it is going to be the remote working issues that are also going to cause the longer-term health and safety concerns that employers need to be aware of. So historically, most employers have been relatively reluctant to agree permanent remote working, usually for business reasons. But I think it'll be very difficult to rely on this, so we can expect a massive increase in requests in the new normal. And employees are really looking to go to results-only environments as opposed to specific hours environments. So remote work planning is going to be part of HR management, and it is going to really need a serious assessment of the health and safety issues of that in the longer term. I know we have a lot of employers currently asking us now about what they need to do to move to permanent virtual teams. So outside of all the other employment law issues, one of the areas they have to consider is the health and safety. So is there a long-term suitable home working environment for those employees? And how do you adapt working practices and management style to deal with lone workers? Is one of the main issues outside of back problems and things like that could become a challenge where people are working long-term at home. The mental health issues will be harder to pick up on, and our virtual teams will have to adapt to be able to pick that up in the longer term. As Jose said, the working time directive is probably not currently fit to work with flexible remote working. The purpose of the directive was health and safety, so it is going to have to be reviewed to see how that health and safety aspect will work with a remote working culture. So currently, the temporary health and safety and ergonomic measures that we have in place for sudden home working are fine, but they're probably unlikely to work long term. And there will be longer term implications of working out of your bedroom as I am now. I think also what we're going to see is a trend of pandemic planning actually becoming parts of health and safety risk assessments and parts of employers' business continuity planning. So it's really going to be a key health and safety issue that we've never had to consider before in our longer term planning. It'll now be a common issue. So just move on to Inez. So Inez, the big question, will our efforts be enough? Will everything employers doing be enough?
Thank you, Linda. Honestly, I don't know. Looking further ahead, we all are aware by now that things will not be the same, although we are unaware on the extent of what will be the same and what will not. Sorry, because now it's my turn to have some construction work on the floor upstairs. We are expanding the office, sorry for that. So what we know is that we will have to adapt. This is a word that we have been listening to more than once in this presentation. We will have to adapt and reorganize. Reorganization will be key. If we think that we will have people in remote work, either mandatory or recommended, as we have seen now, if we think that we will have social distancing that is being imposed on companies and on general businesses, and adding to that, we have people's fear of coming to work and getting the disease, this will lead to a necessary office space rethinking in terms of how you organize your workforce, either the remote one that comes occasionally to the premises or the other one that is there all the time. This can lead also to some savings. Some savings can come from it, or probably not, because if we think of spaces as we have them today, the crowded open spaces, more or less crowded, that we have today are probably not going to be the way to have your workforce organized in the premises, because we will have restrictions immediate restrictions, but they are expected to continue for long, especially if there is no vaccine. What we keep on hearing is that 2 years, 3 years until things get to normal. And therefore, this is a very long-term thinking that companies will have to do. This will inevitably lead to new working practices and also some internal policies that will need to be drafted or redrafted and reassessed necessarily by companies to meet all the legal requirements, health requirements, and also, again, people's fear. Because what we have seen all over Europe, I think, is that health authority recommendations have become the law. So they are issued as recommendations and best practices, but the inspectorate authorities are interpreting them as real law. And people are, in fact, afraid that they will get the disease, and they also want to comply with those rules as if they were law. So this will bring very important challenges, we believe, on the working practices and on internal policies to be implemented. There are some challenges also on this new way of working. The thinking is, if you do not have your workforce all in one place, as you probably don't have today, but they are scattered around the world, they are most of them are working remotely, and you have no real physical contact on a daily basis with people on premises. How will you be able to spot talent, to cherish that talent, and to retain it for the future? This is something that HR, apart from being data privacy experts and health and safety experts and psychologists, as Linda spotted or pointed out, will also have to think about this, which is much more HR than probably health and safety, but it is a real challenge, we believe. And again, if these efforts are not enough, we have to face it, and downsizings will inevitably occur. Some will occur sooner and some will occur later, depending, of course, on the time bar that the respective governments have imposed, but they will all occur inevitably. So this is all for me now. Thank you for your attention. I will quickly move to conclusions because I am conscious that we are a bit out of our time, and therefore I am supposed to do a wrap up. And as we have heard today, and is really not news to anyone that is listening, March was the month of lockdown a bit all over Europe and the rest of the world to some extent. With lockdown being imposed, economies were struggling. Many governments enacted some schemes to help support both families and companies. The ones who were able to do it started to work remotely immediately, which is something that 2 years ago we would think was impossible. Actually, half a year ago, we would think it was impossible. We have evolved probably a decade in 3 months in what comes to remote work. So remote work is here to stay. We don't know yet how it will happen and the extent of it. As we have seen, some want to come back, some don't want to come back, some are unable to come back, and some are unable to work from home. That's what we have seen today. But it is indeed the most visible consequence for the future of work from emerging from COVID-19 pandemics. As we now gradually move from strict lockdown to some mitigated form, and all countries are not at the same pace, not even in Europe, let alone the rest of the world, some short-term and long-term issues arise, and that is what we tried to review today and speak about. So we spoke about discrimination on the short-term issues, that discrimination leading to homeschooling, childcaring challenges, disabled people and vulnerable people challenges, also paid and unpaid leaves, and how this will be reverted in the future, if at all reverted. We have also spoke about data privacy and IT, the widespread use of virtual platforms, the cultural change that has occurred and will further occur, we are sure of that, the awareness of the security hurdles that this crisis has raised versus the employee privacy, which we have been so keen in protecting up until today. And this is, in fact, the challenge if we look at disabled characteristics having to be spoken about to try and address them. Bring your own device was also one of the questions that was addressed on data privacy and IT, and will be necessarily something to tackle. Then on the short term still, we spoke about immediate health and safety issues, lockdown fatigue, workplace inspections, training on new measures being required, and the heavy burden that it will impose on companies. Again, vulnerable employees were an issue and something to be thought and well thought about. And also the importance of communicating to employees what is going on, what will happen, has been spotted as a short-term issue. On the incentives to retention, we spoke about temporary job retention schemes, cash support to families on absences, and bar on dismissals for some countries, for companies that have used state funds. But we also spoke about long-term issues. The increase of claims resulting from lockdown-related measures, wrongful dismissal, discrimination claims, whistleblowing on health and safety, audits from public entities giving rise to probably fines and claims from those public authorities for fraudulent or abusive use of state funds. On working time, we spoke about recording. We identified around-the-clock availability versus the right to disconnect of employees, time on and time off, and the equal treatment challenge of remote workers and the ones who are occasionally working remotely. On the long-term remote work health and safety, we saw the issues emerging from permanent virtual teams, the adjustment of working practices that will be required, the well-being issues that are expected to arise, especially on mental health, emerging from anxiety and stress, and the difficulty it will be to spot them when everyone is virtually working, or working virtually, sorry. The Working Time Directive needs to adapt and adjust, as it will probably be unfit in the near future, and the economic measures that will be required, and we don't know yet who will be paying for them. Last but not the least, the not so good part of it, the restructuring that everyone will have to undergo to adapt and move forward, rethink the space, the costs, the working practices and internal policies, rethink recruiting and talent retention, and in the end, downsizing if needed. So adapt, adjust, remote and virtual are probably the words that will be on our vocabulary for the near future and not so near future. Thank you all for your attention. I'll pass it on now to Linda for some Q&A. I don't know if we have time. Linda?
I think we have time for one question, and luckily we are getting some questions on the same theme. So it's a question for you, Colin. What do you think will be the most common employee claim that your clients will have to deal with following lockdown? What are you expecting the biggest increase in?
I think the most common will be unfair dismissal, but the most important will be discrimination and whistleblowing. There you go. There's an answer in a sentence.
That's very good. Sticking to the time as well. Annie, I'll hand over to you to wrap up.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, we are very conscious of time, and I'm sure that we missed some questions, but the presenters will remain available also by email. If ever you have questions that are not related to one of the jurisdictions that were covered today, you can also contact me. Here's my email address. You can see it. You can also go to our website, to the people pages, and there you can find right contact. Then for further updates on the coronavirus, we have a coronavirus page on our website with multiple resources available. From there, you can, for example, download our coronavirus guide for international employers and find information for 58 countries. That's it. So I would like to thank everybody for joining, and also thanks to our speakers for sharing their important insights. So yes, that's it. Thank you, everybody, and this webinar will be ending.